Hi, I'm Chris, and I want to teach you how to play modern Yu-Gi-Oh! I had a realization the other day that the concept of a meta is significantly more complicated than we take it for. Most players understand that a meta exists and that there will always be a best deck in any given room. But it's harder to describe the reasons that a deck is best or why the meta is the way it is. I want to go through some concepts mainly through the lens of Yu-Gi-Oh! To identify why meta decks exist, why rogue decks exist, and how the existence of a side deck impacts the metagaming experience. First, what is metagaming? Some people think meta stands for most effective tactics available, which is funny but not entirely accurate. Meta refers to something that is beyond or about itself. It's commonly used as a prefix in words like meta-narrative. When a story starts to reference the fact that it's a story, breaking the fourth wall, or pointing out tropes, we call that being meta. This is also a good definition, but it's lacking some important aspects I think that need to be included for our purposes. Metagaming is using concepts within and outside of the game to analyze it in totality. Once you understand the game in full, you can zero in on what strategies work better than others. The game provides us the data, the meta tells us what to do with it. Meta decks fall into a lot of the same archetypes and playstyles I described in a previous video, but in my mind, the power of meta decks can be split in two ways. Either the deck is trying to accomplish something unfair and deny you a fundamental aspect of the game, or they're just better than you. Hand rips, floodgates, and FTKs have pretty obvious and negative consequences for the game when they are meta, but the other category is much more interesting to talk about. For example, let's talk about consistency. Card games inherently have variance. Whenever you draw, you are drawing a random card from a pool of known cards that are in your deck. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, you're allowed to run up to 3 copies of any given card in a deck. Now, the game doesn't automatically tell us that running more copies of a card makes for a more consistent deck, but we can assume so because most of us know how math works. This becomes a little more complicated when we start sorting cards into broader categories like play starters, cards that facilitate your game plan and put pressure on the opponent, or hand traps or things like that. While not the same cards in the literal sense, cards in these groups serve the same purpose and you want to see them as consistently as possible. This leads to the beloved tool of any card game enthusiast trying to calculate probability, the hypergeometric calculator. A deck that has 18 starters is going to be more consistent than a deck that has 12 starters, but you don't technically need a calculator to understand that. It's only by measuring out that consistency and weighing it against every other deck in the game, you start to see how much consistency factors into your ability to win. The game provides the data, the meta tells you what to do with it. Meta decks tend to be more consistent than any other decks in the room, but that isn't the only other factor that matters. In addition to consistency, resistance to interaction also factors into the power of a deck. Resistance is context dependent on the types of interaction that are the strongest and most commonly played in any given format. In other words, there's an entire meta based around hand traps and non-engine and the other powerful decks in the format as well. Resistance manifests in a few ways. The most common is by having effects that trigger in hard-to-access zones. Take Mitsurugi, for example. Most of the cards and effects the deck uses activate in the hand or the graveyard. Not very many cards interact with those zones effectively enough to stop a deck like Mitsurugi fully, and there's no guarantee that you will see the ones that do often enough for it to matter. Some decks are resistant because their cards are hard to target. Some decks are resistant because they have flexible game plans, but most meta decks have a resistance to interaction because most hand traps do not trade favorably with individual cards. Sometimes this dynamic is flipped on its head, like in the case of Malice, where the deck has incredible resistance to commonly used interaction, but a glaring weakness to one specific type of interaction. This doesn't mean that Malice is a stronger or weaker deck, it's just one aspect of it that can be exploited, which is why the side deck exists. Meta decks also tend to have several resources that allow them to repeat their game plan on future turns. It's been said a million times before, but even though Yu-Gi-Oh games only last a few turns, those turns are densely packed with interactive back and forth. Most of the time, because of how resource intensive some combos are and the back and forth of gameplay can be, having the ability to repeat your game plan over and over again on future turns when you've either been interrupted or had your board broken ensures you can come back from a weaker position and keep playing. How much recursion is necessary depends on the deck, but it tends to scale next to power in weird ways. Decks that have a lower ceiling tend to have more access to resources over several turns, and higher power aggressive decks tend to burn through their resources a lot faster. There are more details on this in my video on deck archetypes. Decks that break this rule have a better chance of being meta because they have access to all of the tools, resources, and power. Vanquished Soul, before all of its consistency hits, was one of these types of meta decks. Combined with K9, the deck had the capacity to put up incredibly powerful boards while drawing cards and retaining resources in hand. I wouldn't necessarily call Vanquished Soul an unfair deck though, it just had all of the really good qualities that I've talked about so far. This is the main point that I'm trying to get at. Most meta decks are simply better because of the way they work compared to any other deck. It has all of these capabilities: resistance, resources, and consistency, although Vanquished Soul's consistency has gone down due to hits on the ban list. Once you get below the level of meta into rogue tiers, you kind of end up in a pick two situation, where you can't really have everything without a severe compromise in power. I love decks that have near infinite resource systems. I like when a deck is really hard to interact with in an optimal way, and decks that aren't consistent enough can be really annoying to play for extended periods. But if I want to be playing a deck that is good at all three of these things, I'd probably be looking at a meta deck. That's not the only factor that goes into picking a deck. I like our end game mechanics too. This is a trading card game after all, but it is important to know what qualities make up the meta and what to look for in a deck other than aesthetic purposes. This way we can critically analyze what a deck's strengths are and possible weaknesses to plan around are. This brings us to the side deck, which in Yu-Gi-Oh is mostly used as the magic silver bullet against any given strategy to beat them wholesale. Side decking already requires an estimation or intense knowledge of what the meta is going to be and seeing what counters there can be. Malice, for instance, is very weak to effects that prevent you from banishing cards, like Artifact Lancia, which has resulted in every time that Malice has been perceived as the best deck of a format, it is immediately pummeled into the ground by a bunch of effects that would prevent it from doing so. The side deck also, in its own way, serves as an answer to how strong decks are. If decks are hit by the most common types of hand traps and non-engine and interaction, then the side deck isn't as necessary when we engage with those decks. But when it is, that's how we know a deck is really strong. See Malice and Branded again. But at this point, I'm just circling the drain around the same points. Thank you for watching. If this video was helpful in any way, please leave a like and tell me about it below. Share this around to people you think you should see it, and I'll see you next time.